so far away here. They're very big chairs.
They are very big chairs. Hello, everybody. So this is Justice Kagan. Used to be known as Dean Kagan. And Justice Kagan is an alum of Harvard Law School and Princeton and Oxford. Spent some years in private practice as a law teacher and worked in the government for 3 years or so. 4 years. And was dean of the Harvard Law School for 6 years and made enormous and excellent changes to the place. And has come back this year to teach her course and to have a conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here, John.
Thank you very much for being here, Justice Kagan.
Yeah.
So, shall we just leap in with some questions?
Sure. Who are all these people?
Oh, so these are our students. They're our staff, and I think there are probably some faculty out there too. So I'd say these
They've
are
heard everything I have to say.
mostly. No. These are mostly 1Ls.
No,
and
the faculty
LLMs.
I meant.
Oh,
Yeah.
the faculty. So these are mostly 1Ls and LLMs, and I spoke with all of them yesterday.
So how many of you are new students, 1Ls, LLMs? Pretty much everybody. Okay, great. Welcome. Yeah, welcome. Okay.
So that's.
What did you tell them yesterday? In a nutshell.
I told them, no, don't be nervous. Don't compare your insides with other people's outsides, right? Because everybody's nervous. And then I told them that a great way to be a terrific lawyer is to listen generously to the other side. Is that capture basically? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad they caught that.
That
Okay.
sounds like good advice. Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. You were a 1L in 1983, and you sat in Sanders Theater, and you went through the whole experience of being a 1L. And so, what was it like? How did you feel about being a 1L?
So long ago. Who can remember?
I hope you can.
I loved being a 1L. Although I was very nervous. I mean, almost everybody is very nervous, right? The only people who aren't very nervous are the people you don't really want to have anything to do with. But that's very few. I was very nervous, but I actually loved it pretty much right away. And I was not everybody does. You know, some people it takes time to figure out what they're interested in, what they're doing here. But I was lucky. I loved it pretty much right away. And I was surprised by that, actually, because I went to law school for all the reasons that people say not to go to law school. Have you ever heard these speeches about don't go to law school if it's just because you've eliminated all other possibilities, or because you want to keep your options open, or things like that?
That's why I went too.
That is why I went to law school.
Yeah.
You know, it was like, you know, I knew I wasn't going to go through organic chemistry and become a doctor and, you know, whatever. I mean, I sort of went to law school without a good idea of why I was there, in a way that I actually even, you know, when I was dean, I sort of encouraged people to think about whether they wanted to go to law school in ways that I didn't. So I view it as really good luck and good fortune. I had wonderful, wonderful professors in my first year and a wonderful section. And so I really enjoyed my classmates and my teachers. And I just loved doing law, thinking about law. And what I liked about it was on the one hand, really stimulating intellectually. You know, it was sort of like doing a crossword puzzle every day. It had this sort of puzzle-like quality to it, and was very challenging and hard. And on the other hand, and these two things don't always go together, don't even often go together. On the other hand, it seemed as though you understood why it mattered. So in addition to being intellectually very stimulating and challenging, it was pretty obvious how much it mattered to people's lives and how much you could do with this sort of learning. And I loved the combination of those two things. As a law student and as a lawyer, I mean, I think that is what has kept me in all my various jobs really interested in what I was doing, is that kind of to coin a phrase that has been used before, intellectual feast aspect of law and law school, but also the kind of you're doing something very real that can make a difference in the world, for good or for ill, and hopefully for good. So, so that's what I liked about law school. Even at a time, as you know, the law school was not as user-friendly then as it is now.
That is true.
Yeah, they almost ignored the students.
If we were lucky. So you said you went to law school because you weren't quite sure what you wanted to do, and you didn't want to take organic chemistry, and very similar to my rationale. When did you figure out what you wanted to do with your career? And was it in law school? Was it later? Did you, and I don't mean when did you figure out you wanted to be a Supreme Court justice? I mean the stuff that went before that.
I don't think I ever really figured out what I wanted to do with my career. I mean, I don't think I ever had this kind of plan.
Right.
So, so for example, in law school, I sort of thought, when you're in law school and it looks like the professors are having a good time up there, and you're pretty interested in law, so you think, maybe I'll be a professor. But I wasn't sure I wanted to be a professor. I wasn't one of these people who sort of knew it. I just sort of thought, well, that's a possibility. That kind of looks interesting. But then I thought I should try some other things. And I went out and I practiced law for a while. And then I thought, well, I missed the academic side of law, and I decided to go become a professor. But then, it just happened to happen that 4 years down the road, one of the judges who I had clerked for started to work in the White House, and he said, come with me and come into government. And I'd always been very interested in government and in politics and in policy. So I thought, well, that sounded like a good idea, and I moved to do that for 4 years, which I had really no plans to do. It was just, I think a lot of great legal careers are based on a kind of serendipity, which is whether you have a plan or not, just things happen that all of a sudden throw you off the plan. Or if you didn't have a plan, it's just you look for opportunities. And I think a lot of my career has been like that. It's just I've had the good fortune to have some opportunities thrown my way. At some certain point, I came back to academia, but then I decided to go into administration to become what you are now, and that's a very different job. And then, I mean, just to give you sort of an example of how fluky life is, if you had asked me when I was sitting in your job, well, what's the next thing you're going to do? I would have said, well, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the law entirely. I'm going to go be like a university professor, right? And that will have nothing to do with the law. And then, as luck would have it, President Obama asked me to become Solicitor General, and all of a sudden I was doing law in a way that I had really never, I was really doing law. So life is funny. I think life is funny, and some people have plans, and some people, and great for them. And some people have a particular interest, and they know that this interest is going to sustain them for their entire lives, and I admire those people. But it's just not the way that sort of it happened to me. What happened to me was something more like things seemed interesting at particular moments in time, and I sort of knew enough to follow those particular interests at those particular moments, and then I would sort of backtrack and change and veer around a lot. And for me, maybe because I have a short attention span or something, that was a really satisfying way to build a career.
Did you have any sense in law school of what you, sort of where you were headed? Did you know you wanted to litigate, or it was?
I guess I knew I was interested in the more public law side of things than to be a transactional lawyer. But I was really pretty open.
That's good. Good.
And I tried to take a lot of things in law school, which I if you looked at my law school transcript, it had lots and lots of different kinds of courses in it. It had the public law side of courses, but I took a lot of the private law side of courses, and And I liked that. I felt like I was getting a good grounding in a whole lot of subject areas and reaching out in ways that, it turns out that often, I think, in law school, that the things you really like are not necessarily the things you expect to really like, or vice versa. So one of my favorite classes in law school was tax. And I think I kind of took tax because in some book they told you tax is a recommended course. I don't know if, I don't think Harvard does that anymore.
We don't.
But there was a set of, but I thought, well,
but it's a great course.
It's
yes.
a recommended course, I should take it. But I had no expectation of liking tax. And it turned out I loved tax because it did have, this sort of puzzle-like quality to it. And it was hard and challenging and complicated. And you had to stretch your mind to make it all work. And I loved that.
So, could I ask you a very practical question about law school? Because we have a bunch of people in this room who have not had their first law school class, and this may be on their minds. How did you feel about being cold called in class? And then when you were a professor, did you cold call people?
The first, the answer to your first question is I got over my fear of being cold called very quickly because in my section, I was the absolute first person to be cold called. So first day of civil procedure, which was our first class, Professor Shays, who was a miraculously great professor and a great Socratic professor, called on me first. And, it's like a big deal to be called on first. And you're sort of terrified because you have nothing to compare yourself with. You don't have the ability to say, everybody sounds kind of fine, But I got it over with. And, I thought I had done not terrifically, but not terribly, someplace in the middle, which is what mostly everybody does.
Uh-huh.
And so I lost my fear of it early, and that was a very good thing. Because people shouldn't be fearful of it. It's just like, it's fine. I even liked it, actually. I mean,
it keeps you alert, definitely.
It keeps you alert, it keeps you awake, it keeps you, and it's actually a great way to learn, I think. So the second part of your question, I was a very Socratic teacher. I mean, pretty much my entire class was me calling on people and people answering, and the way I conducted my class and sort of the speed and the rhythm of it, there was not a lot of volunteering because people sort of knew that we were on sort of a train that was going someplace and that we were going to get there through Socratic teaching. And that will be true of some of your classes. It won't be true of others of your classes. People can teach, great teachers can teach in a wide variety of ways. But I was really Socratic and did sort of everything that way. And one of the reasons I did that was I just think it helps people learn. It's like it forces you to be an active participant in a class rather than just to be a note taker. And it also develops skills that you'll use throughout your life, whether you're a litigator or whether you're some other kind of lawyer. That it actually helps to be able to think on your feet and to say some things even when you're not sure that that you know everything. Because people are often going to ask for your advice. That's kind of the point of the whole game. And expect you to say something, that sounds like reasonably sensible. So I think Socratic teaching helps develop those skills, including among people. There are lots of people out here. Well, there are some people out here who have already developed those skills, right? They're the people that were on their debate team in college or whatever. But there are lots of people like me who weren't. And I think it's a good thing that some of your classes, at least, and certainly my class was one of these, just sort of like got you into it. And got you into, I'll say one last thing about this. I really do think that one of the most important things about law school is learning how, people always say learning how to think like a lawyer, and that's crucial, and you'll sort of figure out what that means as you go through your first year. But learning to talk like a lawyer, like learning to do lawyer talk. And you don't do that until you start trying to do it. And So I think it's sort of too easy if you don't have some professors who aren't, if you have all professors who aren't Socratic teachers, it's just kind of too easy to sort of sit back and let the world come to you. And I think the best way to approach law school is really to be a kind of active go-getter and to try to speak law.
So could I ask you a follow-up to that question? So you said, the important thing is to learn to think like a lawyer. So how would you describe what it means to think like a lawyer?
Yeah, so I'll let, everybody has their own version of this. What's your version?
You're used to asking people questions, aren't you? Yeah. I think what lawyers do is they see the structure of arguments and they understand the way that they understand similarities and differences, and they understand the way rules and precedents relate to the underlying policies in them, and that they can take a problem and break it apart into its component parts and put it back together and then compare it to other situations and sort of make judgments about how the law governs a particular situation. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds completely right, and I'll just sort of add to that. I think an important part is figuring out that with respect to most legal arguments, and all the ones that you're going to be thinking hard about in law school, that there are arguments on both sides, and to try to figure out how it is that there can be arguments on both sides, and to be able to weigh them and balance them, but that's just an add-on to everything you said.
Well, so that leads me to my next question, actually. There are 750 witnesses here. I quoted you yesterday in my opening speech to the incoming students, and I used this quote. And I thought, since you're here, how often do you get to read somebody their quote and ask them about it, right? What did you mean and what was the context? So here's the quote, and then I'll ask you the question. You said, "I've led a school," I presume you meant this school. "I've led a school."
The only school I led.
Yes, okay. "I've led a school whose faculty and students examine and discuss and debate every aspect of our law and legal system. And what I've learned most is that no one has a monopoly on truth or wisdom. I've learned that we make progress by listening to each other across every apparent political or ideological divide." So where did you say that, and sort of would you like to elaborate on what you meant by it?
Yeah, so I know exactly where I said it. I said it in the opening statement of my hearings to be a Supreme Court justice, right? In your hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, the first thing you do is you have to make an opening statement. And that was part of that opening statement. And, it was very heartfelt. And I think one of the great things about this place is that there are people of all different views and opinions, and that they actually find that they can learn from each other, and that they do learn from each other. And I think, you want to be in places in life where that's true. I think that the world is pretty boring, actually, where it's an echo chamber, where everybody thinks the exact same thing you do. It's boring, and you don't learn very much from it, because you already know what you think, and if everybody thinks the same thing you do, there's just not a whole lot of intellectual stimulation or challenge going on. So I like being in places where there's a lot of robust debate about ideas, and here about ideas about law. And I do think that that's the way we make progress, because it tends to be true that nobody has a monopoly on truth. Somebody is true about one matter, but the other person might be true about another matter. And maybe the real truth, maybe you can figure that out, or maybe you can realize that the truth is in the middle. It's something that, or maybe you stick to your own views, but you understand even better why you have those views by being presented and with other differing opinions. So I think that kind of intellectual diversity is what everybody should want in an educational institution. and indeed in other institutions as well. I think institutions work best when, I'm sure that there are exceptions to this, but generally that they work best when there's a kind of robust debate going on. Now, I've been sort of following these, all the sort of like the free speech on campus debates with some attention because I used to do what you do, and mostly thinking that I'm really, really glad I don't do it anymore.
It's fun. It's a fun job, really.
Yeah, okay. But it makes me think a couple of things. I mean, I feel myself like, if I had to confront one of these debates, which thankfully I no longer do, I think I would say to people, like, sort of two very different things. On the one hand, people, when they express ideas, should always try to be civil to other people and should always try not to demean other people. And there are precious few arguments that can't be made without demeaning people who hold different views, So that's on the one hand, the importance of sort of civility in discourse and attention to how the way you speak is affecting others. But on the other hand, I think people should lose their thin skins. I mean, I think people should just be a little bit, it actually helps in life to be a little bit less sensitive and to realize that, if everybody were perfect, everybody would say everything in a way that caused nobody harm. But, everybody's not perfect. And as I said, you want a robust debate of ideas, and you have to give people the benefit of the doubt that that's exactly what they want too. And I do think it helps to go through life with a little bit of your sensitivity worn down, and with an attitude that you're going to give people the benefit of the doubt, and everybody's trying to do what you're presumably trying to do, which is debate ideas in a serious way.
So on this very point, you work in an institution where there's some range of views and approaches to the law, right? And we had 6 of you here last fall, and my observation is you get along very well with one another, and you always seem to get along well with one another. There's a lot of collegiality and humor and friendship and warmth. And so how do you do that, right? I mean, you have very different views. Sometimes you write dissents from one another, and you disagree about things, but you seem to be friends. So how does that work?
I mean, I think we are friends. I think we like each other pretty well, and certainly respect each other, and certainly think that everybody is operating in good faith. And that's really important for the way the institution works. Your old boss and my old friend, Justice Scalia, used to say that if you take what we do personally, you're in the wrong line of business. And I think that that's true. I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't take really seriously what we do, and it doesn't mean that we don't believe pretty strongly, including in cases where we disagree, or maybe even especially in cases where we disagree, that there's I'm right, the other person's wrong, there's something important at stake. These are serious matters. They affect a lot of people's lives, and I think all of us know that. But I think we try very hard to compartmentalize a little bit, and to say, the plain fact of the matter is that you can disagree with people on a lot of important things, and still love that person, and still think that person is a wonderful person whom you want to be friends with. And I guess you could say vice versa. You can agree with a lot of people on a lot of things, but not really think that person's ever going to be your best friend, right? So I think that the two things are pretty different. I mean, I think that on the court, there are instrumental reasons for sure to get along with everybody and to maintain good relations with everybody. because we're all repeat players, and the person who you agree with today is not necessarily the person you agree with tomorrow, and the person you disagree with today, you're going to want their agreement on something else tomorrow. So I think that there are instrumental reasons, as there often are in life, for maintaining good relations even with people whom you don't think you share many views in common with. But I think it's more than instrumental, honestly. I think it's sort of an understanding, which maybe people develop more as they grow older. But an understanding that you can think things are really serious and really important, but still, like disagreement on those things does not mean that the person who is on the opposite side is not a really decent, good person whom you will learn from and whom you will become a better person by being friends with.
It's great. It's great. All right, I have a very direct question to ask you about being a Supreme Court justice. May I?
Okay.
All right, here it is.
That sounds very scary.
Well, you can tell me. What's the best, kind of coolest thing about being a Supreme Court justice? And then there's a second half to that question, which is, what's the most frustrating thing that you can talk about publicly?
The best thing is kind of obvious. It's a pretty great job, right? I mean, if you care about law, if you care about the development of law, if you think it's kind of bliss to read and think and write about the most important legal issues that there are in the world, then it's a pretty great job. And that's what I get to do every day. And I'm endlessly grateful for having that opportunity. And as I said before, it's not just about like, oh, these are really sort of intellectually interesting questions. They're obviously questions that matter. And to have the opportunity, and it is an opportunity as much as it is a responsibility, to be in the decision-making process as to those questions, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing. And but I suppose that the most frustrating thing, it's not a question of public or not public, has to do with that. These questions matter, and they're important, and I often have strong views about them. And the most frustrating thing is that when you're on a case and you think it matters and your position is right, and that position doesn't prevail. And the times that I want to sort of punch a hole through the wall are those times when I find myself on dissent on something that I think makes a real difference in the world, and where I think the right legal arguments are the ones that have not prevailed. So that's frustrating. But as I said, I think that you just have to learn to kind of, it happens, and it's serious, and it's important, and it's frustrating, but you have to learn to put it in a box a little bit, and you go on to the next case, and you go on to the next case, and you go on to the next case after that, and you try to make sure that doesn't happen too many times more.
Well, when you write a dissent, who's your audience, and what are you trying to? I mean, is it just that you have a sense that this is my position in the case, and I need to articulate my position, or are you saying, I want to get this out there for some future moment when the court might have a different sense, or are you trying to persuade law students or lawyers, or like what are you thinking when you write a dissent in one of those cases where you are on the?
Yeah, I think it varies. Excuse me. There are different kinds of dissents. There are some kinds of dissents that you write because you think, look, in fact, there are two sides of this case, and nobody should think that this was a slam dunk case. Even the losing party shouldn't think that this is like a 9-0 case. It's not a 9-0 case. It's actually a hard case. And somebody should express the opposite point of view just to give a sense of the different cogent legal arguments that can be made. And then you move on, right? Then you turn the page, And the next time that rule of law comes up, you have no doubt that you go along with the majority opinion and with the majority opinion's implications as well. And so you do it because you thought that the other side was right. These questions are hard. Nobody should think that they're easier than they are. But it's not like a big kind of signal for the future in any sort of way, including as to your own behavior. I think there are other kinds of dissents which are more, here's what I think today, and I can tell you I'm going to think this tomorrow and the next day and the next day too. And I hope that there will be a time, whether it's 5 years from now or 20 years from now, when this decision will be rethought and revised. And you are writing a little bit more, not to just like the parties in the case or to say this was a hard one. You had some people who were on your side, but to say something to the future. And whether the future is, law students or whether it's lawyers. I mean, but to say something to the people who are going to continue to be thinking about this issue, to say that they should continue to think about this issue, that this issue, came out really wrong, and should continue to be sort of on the table.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, still about the court. Is there something quirky or fun about the court that most people don't know and that you can say publicly? Just anything.
Well, I feel like I used to have an answer to that question. I guess I'm going to give the same answer, but I feel as though I have less standing to give this answer now. Because I think that the weirdest, quirkiest things about the court are things associated with being the junior justice. And I was the junior justice for about 7 years, until Justice Gorsuch came along. So I could give this answer for 7 years. And I think now I need to figure out a new answer to that question, but I haven't done it yet. So I'll tell you about being the junior justice.
Okay.
The junior justice had few important roles to play, and it's really a form of hazing at the court. The best of the roles was the junior justice is supposed to write down all the votes, because when we're in conference, there are only the 9 of us around a table. And none of our clerks, none of the people from the general clerk's office. And so somebody has to communicate to the rest of the court staff what it is that we've done. So the junior justice has to do that. But there are a few other things that the junior justice has to do. The junior justice has to respond to anybody who's knocking at the door. So it turns out there's this double set of doors, and as I said, there are just the 9 of us inside. But sometimes some of my colleagues are a little bit forgetful. So they've forgotten their coffee, or they've forgotten their eyeglasses, or they need a different set of papers from the ones that they have brought into conference. So there are a lot of calls that go out from the conference room, and then somebody will appear at the door and knock, and it will be, no matter who made the request, it will be the junior justice who opens the door. And a few years ago, I did something to my foot, and I was walking around for 2 months with one of those boot contraptions on, and even then, everybody expected me to get up and open the door, So that's definitely a form of hazing. And then the real hazing was that the junior justice always serves on the cafeteria committee. So it turns out that there's a cafeteria committee in the court, and really, truly, you go to these cafeteria committee meetings, and you think when you are just confirmed that you're kind of hot stuff, right? Because you've just become a Supreme Court justice, And you're sitting in this room, and they are talking about what happened to the good recipe for the chocolate chip cookies.
That does sound important, though.
And then you're kind of the conduit for all your so you go up to lunch. We have lunch together a certain number of times every month. And people will say, you know, the soup's been a little salty. And you're supposed to do something about this.
So being dean was good preparation, right?
Yes, exactly. And then somebody else will say, I don't think it's salty enough, you know? So yes, being dean was good preparation. I remember the day before I was confirmed, the Chief Justice's counselor came to my office in the Department of Justice, where I was Solicitor General at the time, to give me a sense of what was going to happen over the next few days. And he told me that I was going to be appointed to the cafeteria committee. And I said, Jeff, I do cafeterias, because we had spent so much darn time doing this cafeteria.
I know. They don't know what the food was like before, right? It's very good now, yes. All right. So that does seem quirky. Okay. A more serious question. What makes for a truly great lawyer?
For a truly great lawyer, I think it really depends. I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of lawyers in the world. And so what makes for a great transactional lawyer is actually not the same things as makes for a great litigator. And within litigation, what makes for a great trial lawyer is not the same things as what makes for a great appellate lawyer. And it might be that there are some people who would be great in any of these fields. It might be. But the qualities are actually really different. And one of the things that's sort of interesting to learn as you go through law school and as you go through life is which qualities you think you have and which qualities you enjoy developing, which muscles you like using. Is it the kind of sit around a table and work out a deal quality, or is it the kind of down and dirty street fighter litigator quality, or is it the more sort of intellectual litigator, maybe at the appellate level? I mean, there are just so many different kinds of lawyers using so many different kinds of skills, so I guess do you have an answer to this, where you just say like one set of things is in common to everybody?
I think lawyers, I think it relates back to, I completely agree with you. I think that there are different qualities that people bring to the table in different kinds of lawyering. And I think it's also true that people who have law degrees end up doing lots of different things. And they do policy, they do finance, they do they do the arts. And I think being a lawyer and having lawyers' skills and thinking like a lawyer is helpful in all those. I think the one thing that lawyers have in common is that they're deeply analytical, and that they can really look at a problem and break it down into its component parts. And I think that's a very, very useful skill, and so I think that's very useful. I also think it's useful.
I mean, a lot of lawyers have to be deeply analytical. Honestly, I've met a lot of great trial lawyers in my life who are not deeply analytical people, and who do a fantastic job for their clients. So, I don't know,
I'll take that as a friendly amendment. So how important is it, if you're a lawyer, to be upfront about the weaknesses in your case?
Well, I think it depends on context, honestly. So that's, I suppose, another thing where I'm going to say it depends, like what kind of lawyer are you and what are you doing? Even at our court, for example, to be upfront about the weaknesses of your case. You never want to be in a position where you're lying to us. You never want to be in a position where you're pretending that something is true when it's not true. But on the other hand, I don't think, for the most part, that I'd tell everybody who appears at the Supreme Court, well, just come and be upfront about the weaknesses of your case. I think Good brief writing has to respond to other arguments, has to try to address what the weaknesses of your case are. Good oral advocacy at the Supreme Court certainly has to be extremely responsive to questions and understand that the questions will focus on the weaknesses of your case because that's what matters to the judges, and that you shouldn't run away from those questions, that those questions are an opportunity for you to try to dispel some of the judge's concerns. So I think you can't be oblivious to the weaknesses of your case. You have to sort of meet them and confront them and try to explain why they're not dispositive and why the court should rule for you nonetheless. But that's not to say, here's what it's not to say. When I became SG, one of the justices told me, Justice O'Connor, who had recently retired from the court and who I had gotten to know a little bit during my time as dean, and she said to me, it's very important that the Solicitor General act a little bit less like a lawyer and a little bit more like a judge. And her idea was that the Solicitor General in particular had a different kind of responsibility to the court, maybe because the Solicitor General was such a repeat player, maybe because the Solicitor General was sort of part of the broader institutional fabric of the court, that the Solicitor General had to be very upfront about the weaknesses of her case. And all I can say is that I tried that once. It didn't work out so well. So I went back to thinking like a lawyer again.
Thank you. Good. All right. So I guess what I'd like to ask you, this is another kind of quirky question. So last year when we talked about who the funniest justice was, and for a long time Justice Scalia had been voted somebody had gone out and counted how many laughs people got, and it was Justice Scalia, and then last year it was Justice Breyer, I think. So who do you predict is going to be the funniest justice in the coming year?
There actually, just to fill people in on what this is, there
Sure.
actually is this sort of ridiculous but kind of funny thing that a law professor over at, I think he's at BU, does, which is, if you look at a transcript of a Supreme Court oral argument, it tells you where there is laughter in the courtroom. So it says Justice Breyer, blah 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 blah, bracket, laughter, right? And this law professor goes through and he counts all the laughters. And then
this is a tenured professor, probably, yes.
Although I think he's been doing it for years, and then he keeps track of it all. And now that tweeting has taken over the world, he actually tweets frequently about it, just to tell everybody who's in first, who's in second, who's in third, whatever. It always used to be the case, when Justice Scalia was alive, it was invariably the case that Justice Scalia was the funniest justice by this measure. And now I am afraid, not afraid, but there is a new funniest justice by this measure. I don't expect that the first position will be taken over by anyone else, and that's Justice Breyer. So Justice Breyer continues to be, I think, the funniest justice.
And may I ask, what makes him funny?
A different thing from Justice Scalia, actually. It just turns out that just as though there are many ways to be a great lawyer, there are many ways to be a funny justice, So Justice Scalia was always funny because he would have these very sharp, very quick retorts to people that were just pretty funny. But it's sort of often, not always, but often in a little bit acerbic, right? Yeah. And
yes, I worked for him.
Yeah. But just this real sharpness, right? Justice Breyer is funny because of his hypotheticals. Justice Breyer gives these hypotheticals, and they're often unusual, and people, and they're funny too. Yeah.
Was he that way as a professor? He was your antitrust
He was
professor,
my antitrust
yes?
professor.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Was he funny as a professor?
I don't remember. He was a very good professor.
Uh-huh.
And we were on the losing side of an important antitrust case this year, and he wrote a really, what I thought was a marvelous dissent in this case. And I thought, you know, I was taught antitrust by the right guy. So, even if we couldn't convince some of our colleagues.
So I have one more question for you, and then if we have a little bit of time left, could we take a couple of questions from the audience? All right, so here is my final question, and it's a very open-ended one, and you may have already answered it in pieces in some of the things you've said, but we have a lot of people in the room who are brand new law students, and so, you know, what advice do you have for them as they're embarking on this great career in this great profession?
I mean, I'm sure there's, you know, as many different pieces of advice as there are people in this room, but I guess what I used to tell people all the time when I did what you do now, and especially talking to first years, I used to tell them, really, like, make friends. In other words, you can think about the first year of law school as just like really working hard and having your nose stuck in a book all the time. And I would be the last person ever to say, don't work hard. I mean, I think hard work is important in school as it is in life. But at the same time, one of the great things about Harvard Law School is your fellow students, and getting to know as many of them as you can, and learning from them. And you know, some of my best friends still are the friends that I made in law school. And so I think that that's super important, both for just your happiness in this institution and afterwards, and also for what you can learn from people. That you will learn as much from your fellow students, for sure, as you will learn from the faculty. But you can also learn from the faculty. So I guess the second piece of advice I would give is to make an effort to get to know at least one member of the faculty really well in your first term, and that, you know, might require knocking on a door, going to office hours, whatever. But to make sure that you that you like go and learn more about what some faculty member whom you like or whose subject matter you're really interested in, what that person does and how he or she thinks about the world. And so that's the other challenge I would give you. And then I guess, you know, the third, which maybe is a little bit less useful for the first semester, but it goes back to this thing about sometimes what you really like in law school you find in surprising places. I mean, to sort of challenge yourself a little bit and to do things that you're other than the ones that you know you're interested in, or other than the ones that you know you'll be good at, and to just take a little bit of advantage of the incredible resources that this school has to offer. I mean, why come to a school like this? One reason is the students, one reason is the faculty, and then one reason is this incredible diversity of experiences and academic resources that this school has to offer. And part of taking advantage of that is finding that one little niche that if you went to another law school it wouldn't have. But part of taking advantage of that is also to try a bunch of other things. And I guess I would say to do that.
Great advice. And sign up for Amicus. No. Inside joke. Anyway. I think we have time to take a couple of questions. So I see a hand over there. Do we have microphones that we can deploy in the? Yes, we do. How excellent. So there's.
Hi, my name's Emma. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been really incredible to learn from you. The law can often be a very male-dominated field, and I know the Supreme Court historically has been incredibly male-dominated. And I was wondering if you could speak to your experiences being a woman in law and being a woman on the Supreme Court justice, and any advice for the many of us who are hoping to navigate those complexities.
Okay. In my life right now, I'm reminded every day of how far women have come, which is not to say that there isn't much more to be done in this field, but the reason I'm reminded of this is that I work every day with Justice Ginsburg. And Justice Ginsburg, and Justice O'Connor as well, was sort of in the first generation of women Supreme Court justices, and then Justice Sotomayor and I in the second, and there are about 20 or 25 years in between those two cohorts of people. And everything happened in those 20 or 25 years. I mean, it's sort of incredible when you think about Justice Ginsburg and Justice O'Connor coming out of top-tier law schools, and they were the stars in their law schools, and nobody would hire them. Law firms wouldn't touch them. Judges wouldn't hire them. They had to create these careers entirely from scratch. If you have seen many movies about Justice Ginsburg, or read about Justice O'Connor's life. Justice O'Connor has a wonderful autobiography. You know this, that there was just the kinds of things, the doors that were closed to them were really, it's quite amazing that they created these years, notwithstanding the fact that basically everybody wanted them to be their secretary. And that's just, by the time I got to law school, that just was not true. When I went to law school, this law school was 40% women. Now it's closer to 50%, of course, but 40% is still a lot. And law firms wanted to hire you, and judges wanted to hire you, and there were no doors that were closed. Now, I do think that the challenges for women now in the law have more to do with the way the law is structured to demand hard work and to make it more difficult to combine a high-flying career with a great family life. And that's, in different respects, a problem for both men and women, but certainly in a world in which women more often do more than their share of family responsibilities. I think that's the challenge for the structures we set up to provide legal services. But I don't know. I think we're going in the right direction. Justice Ginsburg always says, when she was asked what's it like to have three women Supreme Court justices, her line is something like, well, 5 would be good. And then she sort of pauses, and then she says, 9 would be good. So maybe one day.
I think that's a great thing on which to close, and I want to thank you, Justice Kagan. Please join me in thanking Justice Kagan.